आज थोडे कालच्यापेक्षा जास्ती जण आहेत की काय अशी शंका बाळगायला जागा आहे. याबद्दल मी शासनाच्या वतीने दिलगिरी व्यक्त करतो. भर दुपारी एवढ्या जणांना त्रास द्यायचा आहे. By now you may have begun to realize that however hard I try to deal with a topic in defined time, it always turns out to be inadequate. I always leave the classroom with a sense of inadequacy. For even today's session, I was taking a review of what all we have done for 12 sessions, and my feel is we have just begun to deal with the surface of the Constitution. I can't even say that we have done with dealing with the surface of the Constitution. But that is how the process of knowledge works really. Every time you pick up a new area or even one single topic is like one full session of at least an hour and a half, and that too, that would be a brief summary. For example, part 1 of the Constitution basically talks about India, that is Bharat. Defines India as union. Then part 2 lays down the provisions of citizenship. Outwardly speaking, this may appear to be a pretty simple issue. Citizens of India. But that's not how it is. Because you have to define what is a citizen. And then think of the time when the Constitution was being drafted and step by step brought into existence, that we were facing probably the greatest cataclysm of our entire history, that is partition. A horrible bloodbath. India's partition is the worst civilian bloodbath of 20th century. So even First and Second World Wars actually pale into insignificance because that is military violence. What happened around partition is even horrible to imagine. Even today, nobody knows how many people died. Historians and experts talk of the figure of anywhere between 2 to 3 million people. Not a small figure really. And till today, nobody knows how many people were displaced, how many people from India went into Pakistan, how many came over from Pakistan to India, and after a while maybe some of them even went back to their original places. All very complex situation. And I know that there are hundreds of books written only on this issue, the topic of citizenship. Well, how do you define a citizen? There is a distinction between a citizen and a domicile, or also residence. Once the Indian Union is created under India Independence Bill 1947, it was very easy for those who were already staying for a long time in the same territory. But what about those millions who either left out of their free volition or had to leave, like India, maybe many of them like Muslims? Probably among the worst of the names is so-called Dr. Abdul Qadir Khan. Again, Pakistan's so-called scientist who is actually a nuclear terrorist. He was from Bhopal. And thanks to partition, his family, which actually wanted to stay over in India, thought that they are required to leave Bhopal. They may not be safe in Bhopal, plus the dream of an Islamic nation and all. Abdul Qadir Khan nurtured hatred for India for the rest of his life and continues to do so. Well, how does he become Pakistan's citizen? That is a matter for Pakistan to decide. But those thousands and millions of people who came into India, into the new Indian territory, how do you define their constitutional stature? How do you prepare proper voters lists and also the NCR, as it came to be called, the National Citizens Register. That was finally prepared in 1951. Just try to think of the magnitude of the task, the National Citizens Register. The entire country, India's approximate population even then after partition was around 40 crore. Not a small task. Think of the administrative challenge behind it. And also the very partition, the bloodbath. There are, like I said, many books written only on this issue of citizenship. Today, it all looks very simple. If it looks very simple today, it is thanks to those who worked during that time. And the stupendous task that India achieved, I must tell you that even today, Pakistan has not achieved that task, not from constitutional point of view, not from statutory point of view. Those original Indian Muslims who went to Pakistan in search of that ideal Islamic nation, they were not internalized, they were not integrated with Pakistani society, they continue to be called Muhajirs, which have come to be a derogatory term. And over here in India, thanks to the way constitution functioned, citizenship statutes were formed, and finally administrative work was done. They are all so very well integrated with India that nobody looks down upon them that you came from Pakistan territory with barely your clothes on, and now our country has given you asylum, etc., because we think of them as our people. This was achieved during the years from 1947 to 51. In fact, I would say all of us have every reason to even feel proud that even before the constitution went into action, that is before November 26, 1949, this task of citizenship was already achieved. Who is to be called a citizen? And then what a great task that there is one single indivisible citizenship. In fact, when we use the term domicile from the constitutional point of view, there is only one domicile, and that is India. At the most, we may talk of residence. That where your normal place of residence, but the constitution makes us all Indians, the citizens. And where are we domiciled? The constitutional answer is India, that is Bharat. Then we can say our normal place of residence is Pune, and Pune happens to be in Maharashtra. But single citizenship concept and a single domicile lays down the foundation of national integrity. I hope you really, as we study the constitution, you begin to understand the magnitude of what we achieved. And I continue to think that we are still skimming at the surface. This fascinating depth of knowledge. And every time the issue comes up, Bangladeshi infiltration into Assam, now ongoing Bangladeshi infiltration into Bengal, partition into East and West Bengal, then East and West Punjab, all issues about Kashmir, all of them deal with the original issue of citizens. The way they were tackled is a fascinating story. And like I always keep saying, every time I walk out of this auditorium, I think we have just touched upon the broad contours. Also think of the time we have spent on legislature, executive, and nothing as yet on judiciary. There is reason to say that we have seen the broad contours of legislature, yes. But when it comes to executive, my mind reminds me that some important points are still left to be stated. So here I am making a choice of spending a few required minutes about some basics about the executive. In terms of legislature, the Constituent Assembly made a conscious decision of adopting the Westminster model. So it's the multi-party democracy based on the parliamentary model. When it comes to executive, we came up with a combination of the British system and the American system. Because we picked up the president as the highest head of our state, and then we decided that president will not be hereditary for larger part of post-independence 70 years, we decided that the post of Prime Minister should be hereditary. But that's not built into the Constitution. That is our voters' behavior. But when it came to the President, Constituent Assembly was very clear that India will be democratic republic. That precedent is actually picked up from the American concept. But while American president is also the highest chief executive with all executive powers, Indian Constitution made a choice of turning the executive, that is president, on the similar lines of the British monarch or queen. The British monarch or queen do not have executive powers. The British monarch appoints the council of ministers, appoints the prime minister, who then appoints the council of ministers. But the British monarch or queen is bound by the recommendations of the council of ministers. This is what we adopted. So there is precedent. His powers and duties are properly laid down. There is its parallel version at the state levels also, where head of state is governor, who is the representative of the president. And we decided to go in for the republic form, that is the highest head will not be hereditary. Then single name for our executive system is the cabinet system. We adopted the cabinet system. This is the British system. That the president shall appoint the prime minister, who will then appoint the council of ministers. Council of Ministers will enjoy their post during the pleasure of the President. Council of Ministers doesn't have tenure. And that pleasure of President is defined by what Prime Minister says. So Prime Minister can recommend the President to remove a particular minister, and then the President will be bound by that system. India's executive should best be known as the cabinet system. Defining feature of cabinet system is principle of individual and collective responsibility. At least ideally speaking. For the larger part of last 70 years, we cannot say that this principle has actually worked out. Principle of individual and collective responsibility means that every single minister is individually responsible for the decisions by his ministry, while the entire Council of Ministers is collectively responsible for every single decision by every single minister. Now, one can never argue that a particular decision was taken by that minister and so that he or she is responsible. It's not like that. It's the principle of individual and collective responsibility. You will never see during last 70 years any cabinet having ever resigned on the issue of accepting this individual and collective responsibility. At the most, when push comes to shove, a single minister may have been singled out, kind of, you can use the word scapegoat, and that minister may have resigned. There was Mundra deal around 1956-57, that was a share market scandal. Our finance minister at that point of time was T.T. Krishnamachari. And when the scandal broke out, and India had not yet developed this thick skin for corruption and scandals, and the scandal came out. In fact, TTK, as he was popularly known, was not even involved in this deal. But because he was finance minister, when the scandal broke out and the issue is under the finance ministry, he was asked to take the moral responsibility and accordingly resign. But the principle of individual and collective responsibility says that TTK may be individually also responsible, but the entire cabinet is also responsible for all decisions. There is a Mughal Sarai accident of railway when we had none other than Lal Bahadur Shastri as railway minister. He went to the extent of accepting the moral responsibility of the accident and tendered his resignation for one single accident. Actually, he has laid down a very high stature of moral principles in doing so, but it is individual responsibility. The 1962 debacle with China, and there was tremendous furor in the country, and the country, including the parliament, was of course asking for somebody's blood and somebody's head had to roll. So Krishna Menon, who was defense secretary then, was picked up. He accepted the responsibility, but it's not like that. Actually, deeper you analyze 1962, with all due respect, the Prime Minister himself was responsible for the debacle. But Krishna Menon accepted all responsibility and resigned. You will see this happening all 70 years. But on paper, the constitutional scheme is that the cabinet is individually and collectively responsible for all the decisions. A cabinet minister, in his capacity as cabinet minister, makes a statement. Neither government nor the party in government can say that that is his or her personal opinion. That's not personal opinion. The government has to own up the responsibility and show its answerability to people. So the broad contour of executive, the way Indian executive functions. Then we need to see similar broad outline of the way judiciary is organized before we now start getting into this utterly thrilling part of fundamental rights and directive principles. Indian judiciary itself, by definition as an institution, is a federal principle because it shows division of power. But the way judiciary itself is organized, it's a single chain of command. So the organizational structure of judiciary shows unitary feature. Indian constitution does not have the proper scheme for judiciary at, you can say, state level, and a different judiciary at federal/union level. That is so under American Constitution. But Indian judiciary is unified at 3 levels. So it's a district level, the state level, and the national level. And the courts within the districts are under district court. The lowermost level at taluka level is divided into civil court and criminal, the one that would handle criminal cases. That judge comes to be called as Judicial Magistrate First Class, JMFC, at taluka level. And the judge who handles civil cases comes to be called as Civil Judge, Junior Division. Then it is the district level, DJ, District Judge. Then it is the High Court at the state level and Supreme Court at the national level. There are 2 types of jurisdictions we need to understand. There is territorial jurisdiction and there is subject jurisdiction. So it is well defined each court-wise which are the subjects that particular court can entertain and what is their jurisdiction. So it's very easy for district, etc. For the high courts, there is no limit on subject jurisdiction. High courts can entertain all kinds of cases. But there is restriction on the territorial jurisdiction of high courts, their defined territory. So Bombay High Court has jurisdiction over Maharashtra and Goa. And similarly each one. So territorial jurisdiction is limited. When it comes to Supreme Court, the order reverses. With respect to Supreme Court, there is no limit on territorial jurisdiction within the territory of Indian Union. But there is restriction on subject jurisdiction. There are rare cases which Supreme Court can entertain directly. At best, a citizen wants to approach, then his or her first access has to be at the High Court level. There are very, very few cases, and that too Supreme Court can make a choice that we will call for this case, and Supreme Court will directly accept those cases. There is what is called as a writ jurisdiction. Like fundamental rights of citizens are guaranteed by the Constitution, and the task of judiciary is to protect those fundamental rights of the citizens. Even if a single citizen feels disturbed or my fundamental rights are abrogated under Article 32, any citizen can approach But the first level, first approach will have to be to the High Court. No writ, or let me put it this way, hardly any writ. It is the discretion of the Supreme Court sometimes. Sometimes the Supreme Court may entertain a direct writ to the Supreme Court. But otherwise the normal feature is any writ will have to first go to the High Court. There are 5 types of writs. Writ is a written challenge for protection of fundamental rights. And when it is a writ under Article 32, it is regarding fundamental rights. But apart from fundamental rights, there are many other rights guaranteed by the Constitution. So let it be clearly understood that it's not like only fundamental rights are the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. Fundamental rights are there in Chapter 3. Those are Articles 14 to 32, and they are guaranteed by the Constitution. We are going to go deeper there. But apart from Articles 14 to 32, throughout the Constitution, various articles create rights upon citizens. Think of right to vote. That is nowhere there within Article number 14 to 32. But right to vote is a derivative. It is enshrined there in the Constitution, and so many other kinds of rights like. So if a citizen feels harmed by some executive decision, that my rights as enshrined in the Constitution, they may not be fundamental rights, they are constitutional rights. Sometimes they come to be called as statutory rights. When we refer to the term statutory, it means that right is derived from a law passed by the requisite legislature, and the act of passage of that law is based on constitutional principles. That is that link. So a citizen can challenge, but then it is Article 226. Such a writ will emanate from Article 226. So Article 32 refers to writ challenging fundamental rights. And any other writs from the rights guaranteed by the rest of the part of Constitution or other laws will be under Article 226. And there are 5 types of writs. Probably the most famous one is known as habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means present the person. So if executive is taking any action against any person, the person has every right, or on his behalf, the interested parties, legally interested ones, can approach the court, ask the person to be presented in the court. So this is a guarantee against arbitrary action by executive against a citizen. Habeas corpus. Another one is called writ for mandamus. Writ for mandamus would mean a citizen requesting court, that this will be High Court, to demand certain documents or files to be presented before the High Court. And if the High Court agrees, the High Court can ask the executive to present particular files. This is writ for mandamus. Produce those papers and present the file. We need to be doubly sure about how you took this decision. Is it within the framework of the Constitution? It is writ for mandamus. Another writ is called prohibition, where the High Court issues a prohibitory order on the executive. High Court tells you will not do a particular thing. That is prohibition. 4th one is called quo warranto. The term quo warranto means under what authority, or your action is warranted by what. It's the question from High Court to the executive that you have taken a certain action. Please explain under what authority was this action warranted. Why? What gives you authority to take this action is quo warranto. And the 5th one is called certiorari. Sometimes some people pronounce that as certiorari. That pick up whichever pronunciation you find convenient. 5 types of writs to the judiciary. I am now going to say that with this broad outline, we can now commence what I like to always call as a fascinating part for fundamental rights and hopefully directive principles, because they are interrelated. See, every time I say this, my mind reminds me, it shouts. Because I'm not sorry, 2 more points maybe, unless the third one comes up. It's still required to be explained about judiciary. This is very critical. Before we go deeper into this one, and then once we do that, I really continue to hope that you find it fascinating. If you don't, it will be my mistake. 2 points about judiciary. One is one of the most basic principles on which our judiciary functions, and that is procedure as set by law. We need to understand the term procedure as set by law versus another term called due process. Indian judiciary functions on the principle of procedure as set by law. Under our constitutional scheme, Indian judiciary does not function on the principle of due process. Due process means that the judiciary has authority to even declare a law itself as unconstitutional. That means due process. While procedure as set by law will mean that kind of the powers of the judiciary are restricted to looking into the procedure as set by law, whether the procedure as set by law has been followed. By and large, Indian judiciary does not have the authority to declare a law itself as like unlawful or unconstitutional. Due process also means, please remember, by and large the Western system, also in Britain and more importantly in USA, the American judiciary functions on the principle of due process. Its external expression is in jury system. So we don't have jury system. In American judiciary, the judge mainly directs the procedure, but handpicked random people sit there as a jury. And if an accused is presented, an attorney on his behalf and attorney on behalf of the state produce all evidences, cross-examinations are conducted, blah, 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 everything, etc. Final arguments are presented. Okay. The jury is not to decide whether this person has committed a crime as specified under the law. Due process means even while everything has been proven that a person has indeed committed a crime under the law, the jury can still declare that person as innocent. Innocent. Okay, the law is there, but we have heard the whole case and he is not guilty as charged. So it is called due process. That let the law be there. A very famous American sportsperson, O.J. Simpson, his case had rocked United States of America. O.J. Simpson found his wife in some uncompromising positions with his friend. He killed both of them. And police came to know about it, so police came to arrest him. He escaped from his home, drove a car across roads, and a live telecast of all of it was shown to entire United States of America. So in terms of whether O.J. Simpson killed his wife and like maybe her, whoever, whatever name you want to use for him, killed 2 people, was beyond question. But the act of killing those 2 people does not mean he's guilty under the law. Guilty under the law. The American jury declared him not guilty. So it's not only about the act or only the legal provision. And yes, man, it is proven that you committed murder under Indian legal provisions. At best, one could argue that this was an act because of grave and sudden provocation. So the intensity may come. It's not a well premeditated murder, so it's not 302. It is culpable homicide amounting to murder, but not as serious as a well planned murder. That is at the best that can be argued under Indian law, because Indian legal system functions on the principle of procedure as set by law. But due process means it's not just the law or the action, but finally judiciary has authority to decide whether this person is guilty or not. Due process. So again, at the risk of repetition, but I hope it lays down the clarity that American judicial system functions on the principle of due process. What it means is the American judiciary has authority to even declare a law itself as unlawful and unconstitutional. That is not how Indian judiciary functions. There is Land Acquisition Act in India. And if government wants to acquire some land, government has constitutional authority to do so. That is also there in the Constitution, where we are going to go later on. And there is Land Acquisition Act. So government is required to give a public notice under Section 4. Public notice under Section 4. Those people whose land is going to be acquired are then free to say whatever they want to say. Somebody wants to object. Somebody wants to object to the very act of acquisition. Somebody wants to object to the compensation that is specified in the notice and all. This is all to be done under Section 5. And then a government official not below Tahsildar's level, because Tahsildar is Taluka Executive Magistrate, is required to hear that person's case. Give a chance to that person and hear that case and pass the final ruling under Section 6. Once that is done, it is binding on the citizen. And if the citizen is still dissatisfied, the legal structure says that the only recourse that the citizen has is to go to the High Court. If the citizen goes to the High Court, can the High Court go into the question of validity of acquisition? Can the court, in Indian setup, can the court question whether government can acquire this land or not? The basic answer is no, that it is executive prerogative. The constitutional scheme has decided that it's for the government to decide which land is to be acquired. Then what is the task of judiciary? Then in this case, judiciary has to only see whether the procedure as set by law has been followed. Whether proper notice under Section 4 was given, whether proper returns were filed by the citizen under Section 5, whether proper summary proceedings, they are called summary proceedings, under Section 6 are held. And as to the compensation, if the citizen is dissatisfied, the court can go into the question of compensation based on whatever are the market rates or the systems. But overall functioning of Indian judiciary is restricted to procedure as set by law. India has seen a very horrible, nightmarish state of affairs, beginning sadly, and in fact my word is angrily, with December 16, 2012. This is a day Nirbhaya was gang raped and practically killed, and the whole country was rocked. And 5 accused were apprehended over a period of time. By December 21, all 5 culprits were apprehended. One of them was just a few days short of completing his age 18. Now the world, and we know that he was the cruelest of them, but he was just short of 18. And there is Juvenile Justice Act, which by definition says that nobody is a criminal until one attains age of 18. Below 18, you are not a criminal. For whatever act you do, you are not a criminal. And he was just a few days short of 18. Then Juvenile Justice Act says that in such a situation, such a person can be kept under probation. The word to be used is not even jail. It is under probation for at the most 3 years. The law also lays down that this will not remain on anybody, that person's record, so it will never be held against that person, and that act or 3-year probation period will never be cited in the court of laws as his track record, or it's inadmissible, such an evidence, all of it. Juvenile Justice Act. This fifth bastard, I can use the term because I am not restricted to procedure as set by law. He was apprehended and was sent to probation period for 3 years. Under the law, he was required to be released with clean record by December 21, 2015. And as December 21, 2015 began to approach, there was a tremendous sense of upset in the whole country, including myself. Only probably 1 or 2 of you who I would like to say don't seem to be human enough, because I can't see why they are smiling when I'm talking the topic of Nirbhaya issue. It's like, I will have to examine his personal character and whether probably he wishes that he should have been there in the bus. Idiots of the first rank, I'm expressing my anger over this. But except for such idiots who think this is a matter of something to be laughed and smiling, the entire country was tremendously upset about it. That this very person who was cruelest towards Nirbhaya is now required under the law to be released under Juvenile Justice Act. So very many citizens groups approached Delhi High Court first, asking Delhi High Court to use some judicial discretion to ensure that the person remains behind bars. And Delhi High Court expressed entire sympathy with the petitioners, but said, our hands are bound by the law. So while we sympathize with you, the law says to be released with clean record and like incognito, nothing can be held against that person. We are sorry. So the petition was denied. These groups went to the Supreme Court and repeat the same matter. Even the Supreme Court expressed sympathies with the feelings of the people who approached, but it said our hands are bound by Juvenile Justice Act, procedure as set by law. Had it been a system of due process, then the courts could have ruled. For example, in American system there is a provision, similar law is there in American system also, Juvenile Justice Act, but the judge in American system has this freedom to declare that this person will not receive the protection of Juvenile Justice Act, that his crime is of such a heinous nature that I am hereby ordering that he will be tried as an adult. That kind of freedom is not there under Indian judicial structure. After Nirbhaya thing, of course, the Justice Verma committee was appointed. Juvenile Justice Act has been modified, and the age has been brought down from 18 to 16. And rape with murder, if it is a rape with murder, then no protection under Juvenile Justice Act is available. During the days when discussion was on, I did my own little role as a citizen, sending the message to the central government that we also need one more reform over there. Even the act of rape, even if it is not murder, that person should not receive the benefit of Juvenile Justice Act. It's not like something accidental, man. It's a heinous crime, and the person should not receive protection even if it is not murder. And think of terrorism and suicide bombing or whatever. After 26/8, that is terrorist attack on Mumbai, and thanks to PSI Tukaram Ombale and his sacrifice, that Afzal Guru was caught. But there was an initial attempt when Ajmal Kasab was caught. There was an initial attempt to prove that Ajmal Kasab is below 18, mind you. Had that been proved, then with all his crime under Indian law and the fundamental rights guaranteed, some of the rights are for all human beings, and some of the fundamental rights enshrined in our constitution are only for Indian citizens. But this one would have been under Article 21, where we are going to go there after a while. then Ajmal Kasab would have had the benefit under Article 21 and Juvenile Justice Act that he is below 18. And if the terrorists see this chink in our legal structure, next time onwards they will ensure that a suicide bomber or some terrorist who executes horrible acts is below 18. So even after being caught, he's going to say, I'm below 18. These are legal evidences. Fortunately, with respect to Ajmal Kasab, we were able to establish that he is above 18. When it comes to this Nirbhaya case, please hold your breath and remember, in terms of Nirbhaya case also, the concerned advocates and police had insisted on some biological tests on that person, which would have proven whether he is below 18 or not. They were denied. It beats me, I'm telling you. Till this date, it beats me. Why wasn't the test conducted? In the light of his horrible nature of his crime, there should have been a double or triple the attempt to confirm his age. But somehow, under fundamental rights, and nobody can be coerced to undergo such tests. That is also enshrined in the Constitution. So somehow, even the judiciary held that such a test cannot be conducted, and he is below 18. So our hands are tied. It is procedure as set by law. Now, for procedure as set by law versus due process, there is a great exception enshrined in the Constitution, and that is judicial review. There is a provision for judicial review. In a way, judicial review means restricted due process. All it means is, if a certain executive action or law passed by a legislature abrogates fundamental rights, or the law itself is unconstitutional, then judiciary has authority to take it under review and pass the rulings. That is defined under Article 13. Before the part 3, that is fundamental rights, begin, Article 13 makes it clear that no law can ever be passed which abrogates, cancels, or seriously modifies for the things stated in part 3. As we proceed, I know that you are going to be very clear about why I took so much of time laying down the groundwork for all this. But Article 13 specifies that no law, no legislature has authority to pass any law which restricts, abrogates, etc. The fundamental rights guaranteed in part 3, the chapter on fundamental rights. This has become a bone of contention, and on this issue, large part of Indian Constitution eventually comes to be defined. There is a 1931 resolution by Indian National Congress demanding fundamental rights. So it's right to say that as nation we were always aware that independent India will be like democratic republic based on one person, one vote. But every individual's fundamental rights will be guaranteed and protected by the Constitution. So accordingly, when of course the Constituent Assembly started functioning, here now we have part 3 or chapter 3, the fundamental rights. Crux of the entire Constitution is in Article 14, 15 and 16. Truly, not only for me but even the best of the experts in the Constitution, people who devoted their entire life to study and implementation of Constitution, if they are asked which is the real crux of the entire Constitution, I go to this extent of saying that you understand Article 14, 15 and 16 and the three are interlinked. You understand the essence of the Constitution. Because Article 14 is about rule of law. This is not just a game of words. Rule of law means that Indian Republic will not be rule of, say, a person, not certainly a family, and not the cabinet, not legislature, etc. It will be rule of law. So the words will be specified and everyone will be answerable, and the system of functioning also therefore will have to be transparent. Rule of law is probably the most cardinal principle of constitutional functioning, because in absence of such a rule of law, the only rule is the rule of jungle, the law of jungle. The law of jungle, also known as might is right, जिसके हाथ में लाठी उसकी भैंस. But when there is constitution defining rule of law, it means whoever you are, big or small, powerful or not, your rights are enshrined and they are protected, and it will be rule of law, not somebody's whim. Ale devajicha mana. And nobody has any authority of life and death over anything. Everyone is bound. Nobody is above law, and it is rule of law. That also specifies that there will be equal protection of law under the very rule of law, that every citizen will enjoy equal protection of law. This is a great principle. Please remember again. This is the principle of people's sovereignty brought into reality. That all people are equal and everyone will receive the equal protection of law. Then Article 15 talks about no discrimination on the basis of caste, clan, religion, sex, etc., etc. No discrimination. Article 16 is like another offshoot. You can see that Article 15 is kind of derivative of Article 14, and similarly Article 16 is another derivative of Article 16 that talks about equality of opportunity. All Indian citizens will enjoy equality of opportunity. Under American Constitution, fundamental rights are absolute. The term to be used, understood and used, is inalienable. That under any circumstances, nobody, legislature and executive, has any authority whatsoever to restrict, control, abrogate, etc. those fundamental rights. This was the Bill of Rights, which came in as amendment for the American Constitution. But they are absolute, they are inalienable. That is not our constitutional scheme. Our constitutional scheme for fundamental rights is governed by the term called reasonable restrictions. The doctrine of reasonable restrictions. Under Indian constitutional scheme, the fundamental rights are not absolute. They can be controlled, restricted, and temporarily even abrogated, set aside, depending on the situation, as long as that power is there enshrined in the Constitution and duly exercised within the framework of law. So we accepted the doctrine of reasonable restrictions. In fact, in political science, this is always discussed. There is a very famous quip that this political thinker Mill was walking across road, and some youngster moving his stick any which way, wildly, was advancing towards him. So Mill felt scared and he withdrew a little bit and said, "Hey, young man, watch out." Young man, drunk on democracy and fundamental rights. Young man said, "I'm free and this is democracy and I'm sovereign, so I will move my stick any which way that I want. Who are you to tell me?" Then Mill smiled and said, "What you are saying is right, but your liberty ends where my nose begins." His original verbatim statement is, Your liberty ends where my nose begins. So freedom doesn't mean you can go on harming people. This is the essence of the doctrine of reasonable restrictions. So no freedom is ever absolute. That is Indian concept. But it's not absolute. So we understand that they are reasonable. Who decides which restrictions are reasonable? Then if the conflict comes up, the authority is with judiciary. And there have been very many cases where judiciary has laid down the principles about how do we decide that this is a reasonable restriction. That it is in order to establish public order and peace and communal harmony, and it is within the framework of the Constitution. But our fundamental rights are governed by the principle of the doctrine of reasonable restrictions. And every once in a while this issue keeps coming up. We will pay our attention to now some selected articles. At Article 19, as far as a citizen is concerned, I am going to say this is the single most important article for citizens. Because this is about, like we said the other day, originally there were 7 freedoms, eventually reduced to 6. But Article 19 lays down various kinds of freedom. It is freedom of worship, freedom of association, freedom of traveling, going, settling, buying property anywhere in the country, etc. Freedom of forming an organization. That also talks about freedom of expression. Our Constitution, and specifically Article 19, does not specifically talk about freedom of press. But it goes without saying that freedom of press is inbuilt in freedom of expression. And there came this critical issue about right to information. That people, that is citizens, have every right to know how government works. And almost all information within the government must be accessible to common citizens. Right to information. But our executive was governed by Official Secrets Act. That Official Secrets Act was brought in by the British rulers in 1923. So it's pertinent to note that even Official Secrets Act wasn't there until 1923. Official Secrets Act forbids government people from sharing any information with people, the information that they come to know by virtue of their belonging to government. So in short, Official Secret Act drives a wedge between people and government. It's a wall. It's an impregnable wall. And then more often than not, we know that even executive hides behind Official Secrets Act. Until right to information finally came in 2005, there are more often than not, for any query by a citizen, a standard government answer used to be that this is official secret, so it can't be shared with you. Official Secrets Act. It is also pertinent to note that no such law existed back there in Britain, and no such law is there in America. In fact, American constitutional system, as defined for the executive, was governed by freedom of information. Freedom of information laying down right to information, that citizen has right to information. But over here, we had this impregnable wall in form of Official Secrets Act. There is a 1982 decision by Supreme Court. This is known as, and to be properly written as, BNHS versus Pune Cantonment Board. Supreme Court 1982. This is how the cases are written. Bombay Natural History Society versus Pune Cantonment Board. The decision given by Supreme Court in 1982. Over here in Pune, the cantonment, MG Road, famous MG Road, Pune Cantonment Board gave permission for a multi-story building to be constructed. Bombay Natural History Society is a Mumbai-based voluntary organization working in the field of environment. But BNHS had every reason to argue that that permission is not only illegal, but it is detrimental to environment. So BNHS approached PCB demanding for the copy of the map sanctioned, the plan layouts, the construction work sanctioned. Pune Cantonment Board replied, you have no right for this information. You don't have the right, and we will not give it to you. So BNHS went to the district court asking for a directive that please direct Pune Cantonment Board to give us the copies of the sanctioned plan layouts. Pune District Court ordered Pune Cantonment Board to submit a copy. PCB went in appeal to High Court, and High Court was pleased to confirm the order passed by District Court. Therefore, Pune Cantonment Board went to the Supreme Court. Finally, Supreme Court also confirmed the orders by both lower courts, but in confirming this order that Pune Cantonment Board must give a copy of the sanctioned plan layout for that building to BNHS, Supreme Court stated that in fact BNHS has a right to this copy. And in passing this ruling, Supreme Court said that Indian citizens have right to information under Article 19(1)(b). So as back as 1982 itself, under Article 19, the Supreme Court had already ruled that right to information is a fundamental right. But looks like we as a nation and our constitutional system also kind of wakes up ever so slowly. So the movements had to be undertaken. There were already legal provisions over there asking government people to share all kinds of information with people. But finally it was October 13, 2005, when right to information was finally passed by our parliament. Which means now the fundamental right was better defined. Section 8 of Right to Information Act specifies exceptions to the information. Except for this, all other information must be shared, and a system was laid down how a citizen can apply under Right to Information Act. And short of the provisions in Section 8, all such information must be shared with the people. Section 8 talks about any information that will harm communal harmony, public order, relationship between various communities. So, actually communal harmony. Any information of a very private nature. So it's like you can't apply to a hospital demanding that I want to know whether a person XYZ or only YZ suffers from HIV positive or not. Such an information cannot be demanded under right to, because it's of a very private nature, and it's like client privilege, communication between the client and the hospital. So it can't be, Section 8 makes it clear. Such information which will make India's relationship with foreign countries, which will put India's relationship with foreign countries into trouble. So only some 6 or 7 exceptions, like copyright information, or there are two competing firms. One firm cannot demand the information of the other firm because they are competing in the same field. Section 8 is very rational. Except for that, now right to information is a great step in the right direction, and freedom of information now stands guaranteed. Similarly, right to property was originally in Article 19 as a fundamental right. And as we proceed later on, I know that we are going to spend a lot of time going deep. That is something I will continue to say a fascinating part, extremely fascinating part. Whatever happened to right to property. We are going to devote exclusive time for this right to property. Then come Article 21. Is basically right to life, and which means it is right to life with dignity. Article 21 guarantees this fundamental right for all human beings within Indian territory. So it is not only for Indian citizens, mind you. all human beings. Under our original constitutional scheme, Article 45, that is directive principle, spoke about free and compulsory education till age of 14. Right between 47 to 50, the Constituent Assembly was very clear that modern India will be all 100% literate and educated with good quality primary education, because right since or even before Mahatma Phule, we had woken up to the reality that education guarantees right to dignity, right to life and dignified life. But between 47 to 50, the founding fathers were aware that it is very easy to say that primary right to education, primary education till age of 14, but government may not have financial and administrative wherewithal to implement that. So there was no point in mentioning right to education among fundamental rights, because once they are there, they are justiciable, which means if right to education were mentioned as fundamental right by 1950, then it would mean it's the responsibility of the state, with capital S, state as an institution, that it's the responsibility of the state to ensure that every single 6-year-old kid can go to a school, which means have that many number of school buildings and blackboards and textbooks and uniforms, and also nutritious food scheme and those many number of teachers, which means budgetary provisions. So the founding fathers were aware that government at that point of time may not have the financial and administrative resources to actually implement. So they made a choice of mentioning right to education in the directive principles of state administration. I am kind of almost presuming that without even my having said so far, we know that directive principles, part 4, those are non-justiciable. That the principles are mentioned there, those are the directives given by the founding fathers of the Constitution to the state. The responsibility has been entrusted upon the government to bring about a situation where the points mentioned over there in directive principles can be actually implemented. They are from Article 33 to Article 51A. So the Constituent Assembly made a conscious choice of mentioning free and compulsory education till age of 14 at Article 45, Article number 45. And then one could say that by 2002-03, India had developed enough so that the government could garner enough resources and also set in administrative structure to implement right to education. So the Right to Education Act was passed. The very Right to Education Act changes the position of Article 45 in the Constitution. Once the Act was passed, now free and compulsory education till age of 14 becomes a fundamental right of the citizens. It gets enshrined in Article 21A. And it goes without saying that once it is there in Article 21A, it means it is the responsibility of government to ensure that every single 6-year-old kid is able to go to school and have education till age of 14. And if that doesn't happen, if throughout the country of like today 130 crores, even if there is one kid who cannot go to school, government can be sued. So now Article 21A ensures that right to education is a fundamental right. In recent times, there have been this issue of Rohingya refugees coming into India. And as of today, the issue is still like kind of pending before the Supreme Court. But some experts argued that it is India's duty to grant asylum to and properly protect them because we have committed that under Article 21. That argument is misleading because Article 21 makes it clear that right to life is there for every human being on territory as under the law. That the existence of that human being on Indian territory should be as per the procedure set by law and lawful. That presence should be lawful. So you gate crash into India and then claim Article 21 is not done. Government of India has taken a stand that Rohingyas need to be sent back to Myanmar, otherwise they are a burden and some of them are a danger to the country. But Supreme Court is taking a certain view, and let Supreme Court decide, and we see whatever happens. But all of that is happening under Article 21. For today's session, last two, very critical, and I wonder whether time will be sufficient for that or not. I have chosen to talk about our Articles 25 through Article 30. These are the articles that talk about freedom of worship and constitutional protection for minorities. Under Article 25, all points about freedom of worship are specified, but it is in an indirect way that Article 25 defines the term Hindu. That from constitutional point of view, Article 25 makes it clear that all those who are not Muslims, Christians and Parsis will be covered under the term Hindu. So wherever throughout either the constitution or under rest of the laws, the term Hindu comes up, then it means they are covered as long as they are not Muslims, Christians and Parsis. But Article 30 then, 29 and 30 goes on to talk about minority rights and constitutional protection for minorities. These articles very clearly talk about protection for minorities and makes it very, specifies that minorities can form their organization, follow their religion or way of life, propagate it peacefully also, observe their religious rights, everything. All of them are form educational organizations. This has become a bone of contention now, that they can form educational organizations and there is a constitutional protection. Constitution doesn't define the term minority. And then in not defining the term minority, the Constitution specifies two types of minorities. They are religious minority and linguistic minority. In the specific case known as Pai Foundation versus State of Karnataka, Supreme Court, this is 1992 or 3, Supreme Court held that the term minority should be defined at state level. That while there is no definition of the term minority in the Constitution, there is no question of an all India minority. Supreme Court ruled that minority, whether linguistic or religious, has to be defined with state as a unit. The basis for Supreme Court to say this was that the subject of minority welfare is enlisted in the state list of the 7th schedule of the Constitution. So when powers are delineated, the topic of minority welfare is mentioned in the state list. This is the 7th schedule. So the Supreme Court ruled that minority will have to be defined at state level. You will begin to see the constitutional meaning, and I hope the seriousness of things that have been happening. As minority institutions, the Constitution bans government from taking over minority institution. Once an institution is assigned as a minority institution, then the Constitution forbids government from taking it over. What it means is that government can take over all Hindu institutions, whatever is the reason. without even giving proper compensation. And that is all inbuilt there in the constitution. But once an institution comes to be designated as a minority institution, government cannot take it over. But that institution will receive funds from state treasury. This has become a bone of contention in India. I am sure you have begun to see the Lingayat issue that is now being discussed. That the state government decides that Lingayats are a separate religion. Okay, people who say Om Namah Shivaya. The most important Bija mantra is Om Namah Shivaya. People who worship Shiva are not Hindus, because the 12th century great saint Basavanna rejected caste system, and caste system is an integral part of Hinduism. So now that they reject caste system, it means they are not Hindu. This is the, I'm already using the term perverted logic. But of course, declaring a certain community as minority and assigning that religion is the prerogative of the central government. So the issue will go to central government. As far as Lingayat issue is concerned, in fact, it is more political than like religious or even constitutional issue. But that gets handled under Article 30. You will see that under Article 30, various groups of people like to claim the status as a minority, so that they can form organizations which will not be controlled by the government, but which will still receive government funding. So, may I say that the very constitutional provisions have created a deadlock or a catch-22 situation for the country. As back as 1985, Ramakrishna Mission had claimed that we are not Hindus and we should be given the minority status. The headquarters of Ramakrishna Mission is near Kolkata at Belur. And those are that's the golden age of leftism, especially communism in Bengal. And the communist government in Bengal was hell-bent on taking over Ramakrishna Mission. And they could, because the constitution authorizes them. So all plans were afoot to entirely take over Ramakrishna Mission. Communist government was already troubling the Ramakrishna Mission University at Jadavpur. It's also like some 50 kilometers from Kolkata. So sensing this possibility that communist government will take over Ramakrishna Mutt and Ramakrishna Mission, the Mutt had approached courts getting a specific declaration as we are not Hindus, and gave a long list. Man, Vivekananda is not Hindu. Opposing caste system means Savarkar is not Hindu. I am not Hindu. In the end, the logic is nobody is Hindu. There is nothing like Hindu, etc. Actually, let me tell you, beyond the constitutional purview, that's the original plan of those who I call as enemies of the country. That's the original plan. Tear asunder the unity of Hindu society one by one, but use the constitutional principles to do that. So, Article 30. Somewhere, the constitutional problem can be solved if the term minority is properly defined. And then minority organization, is it an institution run by the minority or for the minority or of the minority? And you get an institution called as a minority institution and then use even state funding for propagating your religion and converting. That proselytizing also has become another problem, that it is considered as if it's only a one-way route, that Hinduism is not a proselytizing like religion, but Christianity and Islam are. They have every right. There have been Supreme Court cases where, like, the state of Orissa and state of Madhya Pradesh passed a law that nobody can be converted by using inducements, threats or coercion. This law was challenged by Christian missionaries in the court of law, that it abrogates provisions under Article 30. Fortunately, Supreme Court has ruled that freedom of worship does not mean freedom of propagation of your religion. You have the freedom of worship and you can explain your religion, etc. But it's not unbridled freedom that you can use any which means. But the very fact that Article 30 was used and continues to be used by especially like Christian missionaries, it is as if what it means is inducement, threat or coercion. It is our fundamental right. It's our constitutionally fundamental right and we can do that. Article 25 to 30 in future are going to be a problematic area for the country. But the solution lies in a proper definition of minority and accordingly the minority institutions can be defined. That now brings us to the real crux of the whole issue, the gripping struggle of legislature versus judiciary, executive versus judiciary, and legislature and executive on one side versus judiciary. That gripping struggle is centered around fundamental rights, Article 19, and it is about right to property. We are going to spend tomorrow's session studying that one.